Picture a chemist's shop, somewhere in America in the bright, confident years just after the turn of the last century. Dark wood shelves, rows of little bottles with elegant labels, and on one shelf, set a touch apart as the good things always are, sits a small glass bottle that seems to hold a faint, cold, greenish light. It glows, gently, on its own. In the dim of the shop, it looks less like a medicine and more like something caught out of the night sky and bottled. The label promises the earth, energy, vigor, renewed youth. A tired man, a man who aches when he climbs the stairs now, a man who feels the years settling into his joints, reads that label and feels something lift in his chest. Because everyone knows this is the future. This is science itself, distilled into a bottle you can drink. The newspapers are full of it. The finest minds have blessed it. Doctors prescribe it. The wealthy swear by it. And it glows, you understand. You can see the power in it with your own eyes. He buys a case. He takes it home. He drinks it faithfully every day, and he tells his friends they should too, because he has never felt so alive. And the whole time, with every glowing sip, it is quietly taking him apart from the inside. This is the story of the years when the most dangerous thing on the shelf was also the most fashionable. When the word on the label was science, and the thing in the bottle was poison. I ought to tell you who I am before we go on, because I look at a bottle like that one rather differently than most people do. My name is Hollis. I spent the better part of a lifetime as a coroner and a pathologist, which is a quiet, unglamorous profession that comes down to a single duty. When someone died, and the living needed the true and honest reason, I was the one who found it and wrote it down. Decades of that. Decades of standing in still, well-lit rooms, giving people the accurate answer when the comfortable answer would have been so much easier to hand them. And that work leaves a mark on how you see the world. It teaches you, above all, to distrust a beautiful promise, because I have seen, more times than I can count, the enormous gap that can open between what a thing claims to be and what it actually does to a human body. That glowing bottle promised life. It delivered something else entirely. And the terrible, fascinating part of this story, the part I want to walk you through, gently and carefully, is that almost nobody involved was a villain. The people selling that glow believed in it. The people drinking it believed in it. An entire civilization looked at a genuine scientific marvel and drew exactly the wrong conclusion from it, with the best intentions in the world. Let me be clear right at the start, because it matters to me and it matters to the channel. Everything I am about to tell you is history. It is not advice. Nothing in it is a recommendation about anything you should do or take or avoid. It is a story about how people once thought and what it cost them. So let me take you back to the moment the glow was born. It begins, as these stories so often do, with something genuinely brilliant. With real science done properly by serious people. In the last years of the 1800s, in a cold and poorly equipped shed in Paris, two scientists were doing some of the most important work of the age. Marie Curie and her husband Pierre. They were pulling apart a heavy, stubborn ore, grinding and dissolving and separating it, chasing a faint mysterious energy that came off it. And in 1898, after an astonishing labor, they announced they had isolated a new element. They called it radium, from the Latin for ray, because of the invisible rays it poured out ceaselessly from nothing, apparently forever. And radium did something that no one had ever seen a substance do. In the dark, it glowed, a faint, eerie blue-green light coming from the material itself, needing no flame and no power and no source anyone could point to. Marie Curie herself wrote, in words that are genuinely lovely, about the faint lights of the glowing tubes in their dark laboratory, like faint fairy lights. She kept a little of it by her bed, the story goes, simply to look at. It was one of the great discoveries in the history of science, and it would rightly win her the first of 2 Nobel Prizes. Now, I want to be fair to everyone in this story, and that includes the very beginning of it. In those first years, nobody understood what radioactivity actually did to living tissue. Nobody could have. It was brand new. The rays were invisible, the damage was slow and silent, and there was, as yet, no body of evidence to warn anyone. So the earliest enthusiasm was innocent. Genuinely. That has to be said plainly. The tragedy is not that people were excited in 1898. The tragedy is everything that came after, when the warnings began to arrive and were waved cheerfully aside. Because here is the leap that turned a marvel into a menace, and it is the sort of leap the human mind makes very easily and very badly. Radium gave off energy. Constant, tireless, self-renewing energy out of a tiny speck of matter. And people looked at that boundless energy and asked a question that seems, on its face, almost reasonable. If this substance is so full of life, so brimming with force that it can glow in the dark for a lifetime and never tire, then surely, a little of that force taken into a tired human body would do the same. Surely it would energize us, warm us from within, wake up the sluggish organs, restore the vigor of youth. It was practically alive, this stuff. Why should it not make us more alive too? You can see the shape of the mistake, can't you? It is the 4 humors all over again in a modern costume, a tidy idea, a story that feels true. The energy of radium is real, so let us assume that energy is the same thing as vitality, and that vitality can simply be swallowed. But the human body is not a battery you can top up. That constant energy pouring off the radium was not life. It was radiation. It was the atom coming apart, and every ray it fired was a tiny bullet, and when those bullets passed through living tissue day after day, year after year, they broke it, quietly, invisibly, cumulatively. There was no glow of health. There was only damage you could not yet feel, but you could see the light, and people trust their eyes. So the leap was made, and an entire industry was built on top of it. And what an industry! This is the part that, when you first grasp the scale of it, is almost hard to believe. Because radium did not end up in one dubious tonic in one shop. For a couple of decades, roughly from the early 1900s into the 1920s, radioactivity was a full-blown wellness craze. It was the miracle ingredient of the age, and the marketers put it, or claimed to put it, into very nearly everything you can imagine. There was radium water, sold in special crocks that were supposed to make your drinking water gently radioactive at home, so you could sip vitality all day long. There were radium tonics and elixirs, bottled and branded, promising energy and cures for a long list of complaints. There was radium toothpaste, said to give you a brighter smile, and I will let you sit with the irony of that one for a moment. There were radium cosmetics, face creams and powders promising a youthful glow, and here the word glow was doing some very dark work indeed. There was radium soap, radium hair tonic. There were radium-laced chocolate bars sold in Europe. There were radium bath salts so you could soak in it. There were even fashionable health resorts and spas built around naturally radioactive springs, where the well-to-do would travel great distances to bathe in and drink the glowing waters, convinced they were taking a cure. And there was, and I promise I am not inventing this for effect, a line of radium suppositories, marketed with the sort of claims about restored male vigor that I will leave entirely to your imagination. The word radium on a label meant modern. It meant scientific. It meant expensive and exclusive and good. It was the wellness buzzword of its generation, the thing that made an ordinary product sound like the future. And the wealthy, in particular, lapped it up because the genuinely radioactive products were costly, and cost, as ever, was mistaken for worth. Now, in fairness and accuracy matters to me, a great many of these products contained little or no actual radium at all. The stuff was fabulously expensive, and plenty of cynical manufacturers simply slapped the fashionable word on a bottle of ordinary nonsense and pocketed the difference. For those customers, the Radium Craze was merely a swindle, and they were, though they never knew it, the lucky ones. Because the unlucky ones bought the real thing, the products that actually delivered what they promised. And the most notorious of them all, the one that produced a death so grim it finally began to wake the world up, came in a small brown bottle with a very respectable name. It was called Radithor, and it did exactly what it said on the label, which was the whole problem. Radithor was, quite simply, radium dissolved in water, distilled water, in a small bottle containing a genuine measured dose of radium. This was not a fake. This was not watered-down nonsense with a fashionable name. It was certified to contain real radioactivity, and it was sold on precisely that guarantee. The maker boasted that every bottle held the genuine article, and tragically, he was telling the truth. The man behind it was named William Bailey, and he presented himself as a doctor, which is where I have to stop and correct the record, because it goes to the heart of this. William Bailey was not a physician. By the accounts we have, he was a Harvard dropout who had never earned a medical degree at all, but who styled himself doctor and traded on the authority that little word carries. He had a gift for salesmanship and a taste for the grand claim, and he had already been in trouble over earlier products before he found his fortune in radium water. He marketed Radithor as, in his words, a form of sunshine, a source of perpetual energy, a cure for the tired and the run-down, and in that coy language of the age, for a want of vigor in men. Drink a bottle a day, he promised, and feel the years fall away. And people did. By the accounts historians have pieced together, Radithor sold something on the order of 400,000 bottles across the years it was on the market. 400,000. Every one of them a small, certified, faithfully delivered dose of a substance that would still be dangerously radioactive long after everyone reading this is gone. It was, in the most literal sense, poison sold by the case, with a smile, and a doctor's title that was not real, to people who trusted both. And to understand what Radithor actually did, you have to meet the man who became its most famous customer. His name was Eben Byers, and he deserves to be spoken of with some care, because it would be easy to make him a punchline, and he was a person. Eben Byers was, by the standards of his day, a golden man, wealthy, handsome, a prominent American socialite and industrialist, the head of a steel company, and a genuinely accomplished amateur athlete, a champion golfer who had won a national amateur title in his youth. He was the sort of man who had everything, and who intended to keep it, including his vigor. In the late 1920s, Byers hurt his arm, a fall, and the injury nagged at him, a persistent ache that would not quite heal, the kind of thing that troubles an active man used to feeling invincible. And a physician, chasing that fashionable energy cure, recommended Radithor. So Byers began to drink it. And here is the thing that separates him from the merely unlucky. He did not take a little. He was a man of enthusiasms and of means, and when he decided a thing was good for him, he committed to it entirely. He drank Radithor by the case, several bottles a day for years. He came to believe it made him feel wonderful, toned up and energized, and being a generous, sociable man, he pressed it on his friends, sent cases of it to acquaintances, gave it to his racehorses. He was a true believer and a walking advertisement, and all the while the radium was settling into his bones, because that is what radium does. The body mistakes it for calcium and files it away in the skeleton, where it sits and radiates and does not leave. Now, how much did he drink in the end? And here I have to flag something honestly, because the sources vary. The figure most often given is that he consumed well over 1,000 bottles, somewhere around 1,400 doses, before he finally stopped. Different accounts give slightly different numbers, and I would rather tell you the range than pretend at a precision no one truly has. But whether it was 1,200 or 1,500 hardly changes the ending. It was a staggering quantity of a genuinely radioactive substance, taken faithfully into a living body over years, in the sincere belief that it was medicine. By around 1930, the wonderful feeling had faded, and something had gone very wrong. Byers lost weight. He suffered headaches. He began to lose his teeth, and then his health collapsed in ways that were, frankly, terrible, and that I am going to describe only in the barest and most respectful terms, because this is a real man's suffering and not a horror show. The radium lodged in his bones had done catastrophic damage, and the damage concentrated cruelly in his jaw and his skull. He endured operations. He wasted away. By the time the authorities came to interview him, the once golden athlete was a frail and broken man who could barely speak. He died in 1932. There is a line that has followed this case down the years, from a newspaper of the time, and it has survived precisely because it captures the whole grim absurdity in a single breath. The headline reported, more or less, that the radium water worked fine, right up until his jaw came off. I want to be careful with a line like that because it is dark, and it is nearly a joke, and the man it describes was somebody's friend and somebody's husband and died in real pain. But I think it earns its place, because the cruelty in it is aimed exactly where it belongs. Not at Byers, at the promise, at the obscene gap between what that glowing water swore it would do and what it actually did. It worked fine, the vigor, the sunshine in a bottle, right up until the moment the truth arrived. And when Eben Byers was finally laid to rest, he was buried in a coffin lined with lead. Decades later, when his remains were examined by scientists studying what radium does to the body, they were found to be still radioactive. He is, in a sense, still glowing now. That is how long the lie outlasts the man who believed it. Radium, ladies and gentlemen, do not try this. Obviously. And now I have to make the hard turn in this story, the one that lifts it out of mere misfortune and into something that ought to trouble us. Because you might be telling yourself, all right, but they simply didn't know. It was the early days. Nobody understood radiation. How could anyone be blamed? And as I said at the start, for the very first years, there is real truth in that. But by the time Eben Byers was drinking his daily poison, that excuse had worn thin, and then worn through entirely, because the warnings had begun to arrive. Scientists who worked with radium had started falling ill. Marie Curie herself would eventually suffer for a lifetime of exposure. Reports were accumulating in the medical literature and in the newspapers that this miracle substance had a terrible shadow. The evidence was building steadily that radioactivity in the body was not a tonic but a slow catastrophe. And the men selling the glow did what people selling a profitable thing have always done with inconvenient evidence. They looked away. They reassured. They pointed to their satisfied, energized customers, the ones who had not yet fallen ill, and said, "You see, look how well they feel." Confirmation bias, dressed up and sent out to sell. The people who felt wonderful wrote glowing letters. The people quietly accumulating a fatal dose in their bones had no idea yet, and so said nothing. And the makers counted the ones who smiled and ignored the arithmetic of the ones who would not be smiling for very much longer. That is the part that turns my stomach, and I have a fairly strong stomach. Not the original innocent error. The willful, profitable deafness that followed it, once the warnings had started to come in. But if you want to understand the true human cost of the radium age, you have to leave the wealthy men and their glowing tonics behind and go instead into the factories. Because the people who paid the highest price were not the rich customers. They were young working women, and they are remembered now, rightly and with honor, as the Radium Girls. And I want to tell their story with the respect it has earned, because it is, in the end, the part of all this that matters most. In the years around the First World War and into the 1920s, radium had a very practical use that had nothing to do with health. Mixed into paint, it made things glow in the dark, beautifully and lastingly, and that was enormously valuable for the dials of watches and clocks, and, in wartime, for the instruments of aircraft and ships, so that a pilot or a soldier could read them in the dark. So factories sprang up, in Orange in New Jersey from around 1917, and later in Ottawa in Illinois and in Waterbury in Connecticut, employing young women, many of them still in their teens, to hand paint those tiny glowing numbers with fine brushes and radium paint. It was considered good work. Clean, delicate, well-paid, even glamorous. The young women were the envy of their friends. They painted the dials, and the fine points of the numerals demanded a very sharp brush, and so they were taught a technique to keep that point. They were instructed to draw the brush to a fine tip between their lips, dip it in the paint, bring it to a point with their mouths, paint the number. Lip, dip, paint. Again and again, hundreds of times a day. With every single pass, they swallowed a tiny amount of radium. Nobody warned them. On the contrary, they were told the paint was harmless. Some of the young women, in the way of the young and the bored and the delighted, played with it. They painted their nails with the glowing stuff for fun. They dabbed it on their teeth to surprise their sweethearts with a glowing smile in the dark. They went dancing with a faint shimmer on their skin and in their hair. They were called, admiringly, the ghost girls because they seemed to glow. And all of it, every playful, trusting moment of it, was delivering into their bodies the very same slow catastrophe that killed Eben Byers. Within a few years, they began to fall ill, and I am going to describe what happened to them only as much as their dignity requires and no further, because these were real young women and they suffered profoundly. Their health failed, and it failed most terribly in the bones and above all in the jaw. The very same pattern. What had been healthy, laughing girls became gravely, chronically ill young women, some of them dying slowly over years. It was catastrophic, and it was avoidable, and it had been done to them by employers who, in at least some cases, already had reason to suspect the danger and kept the assembly lines running anyway. And here is where these women earned their place in history, and why I say their name with such respect. Because they fought. Sick, frightened, in an era when a young working woman taking a corporation to court was very nearly unthinkable, and when the companies denied everything and blamed the victims for their own illness, these women refused to disappear quietly. It took them years even to find a lawyer willing to take the case. By the time some of them reached a courtroom, In the late 1920s, several were so ill they could no longer raise their arms to take the oath. And still, they pressed on. In New Jersey, a group of them reached a settlement in 1928. In Illinois, another brave group carried their fight through the courts into the mid-1930s. And I want to flag honestly that the legal road was uneven, that some suits were lost as well as won, and that no settlement and no verdict could give these women back what had been taken from them. But the consequences of their courage were enormous and lasting. Their cases helped establish a principle we now take almost for granted, that a worker made ill by their work has the right to hold their employer to account. Their fight fed directly into stronger laws on occupational disease. In Illinois, their case helped bring about an Occupational Diseases Act that took effect in the mid-1930s. They helped force the idea, still young at the time, that a company owes the people who work for it a duty to keep them safe and can be made to answer when it fails. There is a detail from those courtrooms I have never quite been able to shake. In one of the cases, the dial painters were so weakened that lawyers and doctors spoke of them unbearably as the living dead, and yet those same women sat through the proceedings and answered the questions, and let the world look at what had been done to them, precisely so that the record would exist. They understood at the end that their testimony was the only thing that would outlast them, and they spent it deliberately. I have stood in enough quiet rooms to know what that kind of courage costs, and it humbles me still. So when we remember the Radium Craze, we should not remember it only as a parade of foolish tonics and one rich man's grim end. We should remember it as the moment when a group of ordinary young women, dying of their own employer's negligence, turned their suffering into a shield for everyone who has clocked into a job since. That is not a footnote. That is one of the quiet foundations of the protections a great many of us rely on today, laid down by women most of us could not name. Learn a couple of their names if you have a moment sometime. They earned that much from us. I had, for a while, an assistant of mine, a sharp and squeamish young fellow named Toby, who used to turn a delicate shade of gray at the mere sight of the old instruments. And when I first told him this story years ago, he asked me the question that everyone asks, the natural one. He asked how anyone could possibly have been so foolish as to drink something that glowed in the dark, and I told him what I will tell you because it is the only fair answer. They were not fools. That is the whole uncomfortable point. The glow was not a warning sign to them the way it is to us. To them, the glow was the proof. It was the visible evidence of the power they were buying. We know better now only because these people, and these women in particular, paid the tuition for the lesson with their lives. Hindsight is the cheapest wisdom there is. Every one of us dropped into 1925 with the newspapers all singing the praises of radioactive health and a real doctor, or a man dressed as one, prescribing it, might well have bought a case ourselves and felt very modern doing it. That thought should keep us humble. It certainly keeps me humble, and that is exactly where I want to turn away from the past for a moment and turn, gently, toward you. Because I did not walk you through all of that just so you could shake your head at how silly your great-grandparents were. In all my years of finding out the true reasons things happened, one lesson pressed itself into me more deeply than any other, and this story holds it up like a lamp. It is this. The single most persuasive word you can print on a label is the word science, or its cousins, natural, clinically proven, doctor recommended, energy, detox. Whatever the fashionable, authoritative, this is the future word of the moment happens to be. Radium was the wellness miracle of its age for exactly the same reason miracle cures have always sold. Because it wore the costume of science, and it came recommended by men with titles, and it made a promise that spoke directly to something people wanted very badly to believe, that you can buy your vitality back, that there is a bottle for what ails the soul as well as the body. The glow was real. The energy was real. The certified radioactive content was real. Every factual claim on that Radithor label was, in a narrow sense, true. And it was still, in every way that mattered, a lie, because the whole edifice was built on one enormous unexamined assumption, that the energy of radium and the vitality of a human being were the same thing. They were not. And no one checked, because checking is slow and unglamorous and gets in the way of a wonderful story. So here is the question I would like you to actually carry out of this, and it is not a comfortable one. What is glowing on the shelf today? What is being sold to you right now this year, with the word science on the label and a confident authority behind it, and a promise that speaks straight to what you most want to believe about your own health and your own vigor and your own long life? I am not going to name anything, because I give no advice of any kind, and because the specific thing matters far less than the habit of mind. I only ask you to notice how it feels when a product glows with the authority of the moment, because that feeling, that lift in the chest that the tired man felt in the chemist's shop, is exactly the feeling that sold 400,000 bottles of poison. It has not changed. Only the labels change. Be a little slower to trust the glow. Ask who is selling it and what they earn if you believe them, and whether anyone has truly, patiently, honestly checked, or whether it merely feels like the future. That skepticism is not cynicism. It is, I have come to think, a form of self-respect. The head nurse I worked alongside for many years, a formidable woman who had genuinely seen everything, had a way of narrowing her eyes at any grand new promise and asking simply, "And how do we know that?" 4 small words. And how do we know that? If everyone in this story had asked them and truly waited for the answer, a great deal of suffering would never have happened at all. And that is what I would genuinely love to hear from you down in the comments, because I do read them. What is something being sold today, right now, with the full glowing confidence of science behind it, that you quietly suspect a coroner 100 years from now will read about and shake his head at? Not to be cruel about it, and not to name and shame anyone in particular, but honestly, what is our radium water? I am truly curious what you all see from where you sit that I cannot see from where I sit. Tell me. I will read them. For my part, I will keep doing the only thing an old coroner really knows how to do, which is to tell you the true and careful reasons behind things, one story at a time, and to hold every dazzling promise up to the light and ask it quietly, "And how do we know that?" If you would like to sit in on the next one, and there are a great many of these stories still to tell, then do subscribe, and I will keep them coming. This has been a story about a real marvel, turned into a real poison, by nothing more sinister than wishful thinking and the word science on a pretty label. Remember the young women who paid for the lesson so that the rest of us would not have to. Be a little kinder to the past than the easy jokes allow, and a good deal more careful with the glowing promises of the present than feels comfortable. My name is Hollis. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you at the next one.